I'll start the session now. Good morning and good evening to everyone. Today we have an education session today with Professor Jagdish Sheth and Professor John Uslay. A great session, and it will be moderated by Shreeram. But I'd like to introduce our chair for the education SIG, Tariq Khan, and introduce both Shreeram Iyer and Tariq Khan, along with a few others who run the education SIG. Move on to the next slide. Tariq is founder of Games 24/7 and also a venture capitalist, and has investments in several startups. He's on the TiE Global Board as well as chair of TiE Education SIG. And Shreeram is CEO of Qubit AI as well as the co-chair. So I'd like to hand over to Tariq to make the introduction for our guest speakers and for Shreeram today.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good evening, as the time may be where you are located. This is our second speaker event in 2021. We had a good run in 2020, and today we are honored to have two eminent professors. Professor Jagdish Sheth, welcome.
Thank you. And
Professor John Uslay from Rutgers in New Jersey, and Professor Sheth is from Emory in Atlanta, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Moini, thank you for the introduction. And yes, my background is in investments and startups and corporate life, and I try and bring all those learnings together. And what better place to do so than in an education special interest group? We are all lifelong learners. We have to be. The mind is not a stone, as the Chinese said, and unless you want to keep it frozen in rock, you won't survive today, and we all know that. So we've had many sessions, and education is the theme, but today I think the connectivity between education and what's happening in real life, and by real life we mean in the global economy, global capitalistic economy, large corporations and so forth. Not all of us have the luxury of working and operating at that level, but if we are looking at what's happening, it helps set a direction and a trend. So understanding those trends is very important, and we'll have the benefit of the two professors talking about that, especially as they've written a book on this. The format will be the same. Shreeram will be asking a bunch of questions, and hopefully that will be about 75% of our time. Then we have 10-15 minutes at the end for typed in questions in the chat window. And between Shreeram and myself, we'll pick those up and address them to the professors. With that, good luck, Shreeram, and take it over from here.
Thank you, Tariq. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to the people across the globe, based on wherever you are. It's actually a pleasure. And, the guest today, I would just like to do a brief more introduction about, both of them. So and especially when it comes to Professor Jagdish Sheth, I guess he needs no introduction. If somebody is passionate about marketing, you would know him. If you know about successful US presidential campaigns, you should definitely know him. If you want to talk about fortune companies and their campaigns, how they became fortune companies, you would certainly know him. If you're talking about brightest Padma Bhushans in the world, you would certainly know him. And what an honor, sir, to introduce you here.
Thank you.
You are welcome, Professor Jagdish Sheth from Emory University. Professor Jagdish Sheth is our first guest today. The second guest today is Professor John Uslay. So I have no hesitations to say that, Professor John Uslay is probably Professor Jagdish Sheth in making. Why I say so is he is Associate Professor of Marketing and Vice Dean of Academic Programs and Innovations at Rutgers. And let me tell you, after he took that position, Rutgers has got quite many awards in terms of academia. And I have, he also is chair for marketing, entrepreneur marketing at AMA, that is American Marketing Association, which is spread across the globe. So he is one of the finest man who understands both entrepreneurship and marketing very well. At the same time, he has written more than 150 research papers and has got at least 50 awards. That's phenomenal. So welcome, Professor Seth, and welcome, Professor John. I'm looking forward for a great session today and learning a lot from you.
Thank you, but
So,
let me clarify, there is only one Jagdish Sheth.
Yeah, I'm saying in making, the thing is like, absolutely, there is just one. And, it's like, it's a privilege to be, a student of being a professor and then, co-working with him that you have got today. So to the audience, I would like to say, especially for this session, that before I get started with the questions, $4.3 trillion. Yeah, that is the size of current merger and acquisitions over the past 4 years. $4.3 trillion is almost twice the Indian economy, the size of Indian economy. And we are talking like, as if like we are talking about the economies of countries, but that is just the size of mergers and acquisitions. So here we have quite a lot of understanding about what exactly is happening here in this world in terms of mergers and acquisitions. So we'll get started. Professor Seth, my first question is to you. So what exactly is this global rule of three?
There is a theory, every industry, very predictable phenomenon. As a startup industry, as you can see, many of the Silicon Valley industries right now, streaming is the latest one, search engines was one before that one, dot-com boom time, many industries came along. Every time there is a startup industry, it grows very fast. Hundreds of people jump into the industry and there's a shakeout merger, if it is allowed by competition, essentially. If it's not regulated in some fashion, that happens. So people lose money as entrepreneurs or people make money as entrepreneurs. Through the acquisition mergers phenomenon, industry ultimately becomes more stable, and there's only room for 3 players at the top who are full line generalists. They offer everything, and then rest are all basically in the ditch, or some survive as niche players primarily. So in many ways, it is almost like in a shopping mall. If you go to a shopping mall, you will see anchor department stores like J.C. Penney, or you will see Sears at one time, Montgomery Ward, etc. And in between, you will see specialty stores like a Foot Locker, who will only offer specialty shoes, athletic shoes in this case, or you'll find a lifestyle company like a Benetton at one time, or Limited, for example, which will be after a given market. We'll offer everything for that market. Here you offer product for everybody, essentially. So there are 2 kinds of specialists. They coexist. In other words, a shopping center cannot make money unless you have both the generalist and the specialist. The generalists usually make money by volume. Scale is very important. So they race towards scale either through acquisitions, shakeout, etc., or having a technology which they have proprietary rights, like in the COVID situation right now, for example. And then they race toward becoming large scale through expansion, growth, capacity building. And in the process, the key message that we are finding is that while scale comes, it doesn't come from your own contribution in the company as a manufacturer, all the value add you, but it comes from supply chain. So economies of scale, concept really is economies of procurement, essentially. So here is a good example. About 100 years ago, automobile industry began. We had 500 separate car makers at one time. Each one made the car one at a time in a garage. No scale at all. It's like custom built cars one at a time. As we build homes right now in many ways, the same thing. And ultimately Model T came about from Ford, assembly principle. It gave the scale primarily, and industry raced toward that from Great Depression, a lot of shakeout mergers, and ultimately so 3 companies have come about. Ford as a pioneer of the assembly principle, Chrysler came about, and of course the General Motors, which grew through acquisitions, by the way. The Chevrolet founder bought out all other companies essentially and made it into a large multi-brand strategy. At the same time, you see niche players. Many of the European companies were niche players, like the Fiat at one time, Volkswagen at one time, for example, Martin Morris, whatever the company from England you had. Japanese were not even present at that time. globalization takes place now. And therefore, now you see right now in the automobile industry, number one company is Volkswagen Group, number two is Toyota, number three is General Motors, and there's a doubt whether GM can survive as it is, for example. The industry has already shifted toward Asia quite a lot, pretty much, and so we might see new players coming about. Will automobile industry survive in America is a very key question right now, and there are so many manufacturers in Europe, and they are consolidating. Fiat, just as you know, consolidated with the Peugeot group primarily, which are two brand names there. So more consolidation is still possible there. In this process, one thing we have discovered, which is very important to understand, that out of nowhere, multinationals are now emerging from emerging economies. China always is now having one of the top three players in most industries. So for example, if you take Lenovo is number one, number two in PC business, competing with HP and obviously Dell. If there is one more company like Acer, we don't know, there's no need for a fourth one. It's a very key point, consolidation takes place. You find the same thing in appliance business. We are basically exiting the appliance business. Only survivor is Whirlpool. GE exited by selling to Haier. So the competition is Whirlpool around here, Electrolux from Sweden or Europe essentially, and Haier. And Haier will dominate eventually is the forecast. Cell phone industry. We invented the cell phone industry. We lost it. There's not a single cell phone manufacturer in America, interestingly. We are watching the wireless industry. The size and scale is no longer with AT&T or T-Mobile, for example, in America, or Verizon. It is all with Vodafone, Airtel from India, surprisingly, or China Mobile. This is very important thing that's happening. Same thing I can tell you, if you take Grupo Bimbo from Mexico, it owns the largest number of flour mills in the country, mostly in North America. So far, they're expanding globally. If you take Brazil, for example, through private equity, a company called 3G has bought out the largest brewing company in America called Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser brand name, many other brands. South Africa Brewing Company buys out Miller, second largest company in beer. And today they have merged together. So today you find there's not a single beer maker except niche players in America, like the craft beers, you know, kind of stuff. Now, there are a couple of more points that comes about, which are very fascinating. Number three company is the most innovative, not number one and number two. Even though number one and number two may have large R&D inventions, but they are unable to commercialize within the company. For number three, it is a survival game. If there is a fight for market share between number one and number two, usually when the economy is not doing well or the industry is not doing well, number three collapses, it goes in the ditch. Similarly, a niche company which starts something new, a disruptive technology, if it grows too fast, it also goes in the ditch. Yes. You are much better off having a smaller share of the market than race for growth, which is a key problem with entrepreneurship, especially in Silicon Valley. You want to jump and grow, it often does not allow you to survive. I'll stop here. We can go on for more, but raise any more questions.
Sure, sir. So I'll go with the next question with Professor John. So Professor John, here is a question for you. Just I wanted that, you know, we keep rotating the questions. So Professor John, the next question to you is like, the first question to you and the next in the series is, how did you get into this project of, you know, global rule of three? How you got involved in this one?
Sure. First, I would like to begin by thanking you, but also acknowledging for those of you who are not in the US that today is Martin Luther King Day. So for our global audience, every third Monday in January is known as Martin Luther King Day in the US to recognize his contributions to the civil rights movement and activism. And it is observed as a holiday here. And Martin Luther King said, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. So it is assuring to know that the entrepreneurs in the audience, you are all serving your communities as we celebrate the life and work of Martin Luther King today. So coming back to your question, this is actually a question I'm familiar with. It is also asked as, how did you get so lucky to be able to work with Professor Sheth? So I told this story for the first time publicly about 10 days ago. It was received well, so I'll tell it again now, but this time I will also provide an entrepreneurial slant to it. So begin with the punchline. I was at the right place at the right time. But that is not entirely correct. I was nearly at the right place at nearly the right time, but I was also able to recognize some entrepreneurial opportunities and capitalize on them. So let me begin. In 2002, I was in the middle of my PhD studies at Georgia Tech. Then I found out that Emory University, our neighbor, was starting a doctoral program in marketing for the first time. They were just starting. So when you find out that Professor Sheth is offering a seminar in marketing, you figure out a way to take that course. So that was the first entrepreneurial opportunity recognition. And I basically got in the course. I had to interview to get in, by the way, but that's a separate story. And it was one of the most insightful courses I've ever taken. It was great. And a few weeks into the course, Professor Sheth took about half an hour to discuss the rule of three theory. And I was fascinated by it. It was simple yet so rich. It had so many implications, managerial implications, strategic implications, marketing implications, financial investment implications, you name it, it had it. And nothing had been published in any of the top journals on it thus far. So that was the second moment of opportunity recognition that I wanted to do something about testing this theory. Alas, I couldn't do anything about it at the time because, as I said, I was in the middle of my own studies. And as Professor Sheth likes to say, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. Yes. In fact, later I found out that there was a rest to that story too. So a good dissertation is a done dissertation. A great dissertation is a published dissertation. And a perfect dissertation is neither. So I had to get that out of the way and publish my first few articles. But the rule of three was always in the back of my mind. So then I'm coming to a period in my life, there's an entrepreneurial principle called affordable loss. So I figured that I can invest time in this theory and it doesn't pay out, it is fine. I can basically afford to lose this time. So in marketing strategy, we usually try to maximize profits. We basically plan everything deliberately. But in entrepreneurship, actually, you basically figure out what you can afford to lose to be able to reach your goals rather than try to maximize something. That's not the way it really works, right? So I decided to invest some time in it. I was talking to my colleague next door, and then initially she didn't believe me because there were some counterintuitive insights, basically aspects to it. And her attitude was like, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data. So I had to basically bring some evidence. By the way, this principle also applies to entrepreneurship. So if you're basically in a startup, new startup, your first investors will be the 3 F's of finance, of entrepreneurship: friends, family, and fools, right? Everybody will ask you to bring evidence, bring the data, bring basically the reality. But your friends, family, and fools will believe you and invest in you as angels in the beginning. So I had to bring some data. So, and another principle of entrepreneurship is basically bird in hand. So bird in hand is worth two in the bush. You have to basically start with your meager means and use whatever you have available. So I spent some time in the nearby libraries. The problem is not much was available. Another principle of entrepreneurship is, of course, lemonade. If you have, all you have is lemons, you make lemonade. So I put together something with the data, weak data that was available from secondary sources. And then I presented at the Informs Marketing Science Conference in Singapore. And it was somewhat embarrassing because that is actually the conference where people utilize the latest cutting edge methodologies to test their hypotheses. And here I was using TiE tests, basically as simple as it gets. However, it was still good because it was received well and the results were interesting. And more importantly, it was enough for me to convince my neighbor next door that there was something to it that she could work with me. So I guess that conference can be considered a rapid prototyping and launch period. And then we invested time together. And the fourth principle, I guess, of entrepreneurship is called the crazy kilt. So you create partnerships and it can come from anywhere. You leverage resources and create partnerships. So it turns out my neighbor next door was a wizard in the CompuStat database, which then enabled us to create our own market share data points. And we were able to run some sophisticated analysis. And then we wrote it up. By the way, the results were very strongly supported. All the hypotheses were supported. So we did actually extensive robustness checks. So the performance variables we used were return on assets, return on sales, 1-year return, 3-year return, 5-year returns, cumulative abnormal stock market returns, all sorts of control variables, different definitions of markets, operationalizations, and so forth. So we wrote it up and submitted to the top journal in the field of academic marketing, which is the Journal of Marketing, arguably. And when I say arguably, I actually know it is true, but others can argue about this. And then after a while, of course, it was published. And then that is our IPO in entrepreneurship language, right? Initial public offering to the market. And fortunately for us, that IPO went well because the paper received some accolades. It was first runner-up for the Maynard Hunt Award for Best Theoretical Contribution to the Field of Marketing. And also it was first runner-up for the Marketing Science Institute Paul Root Award, given to the paper that makes the biggest contribution to the practice of marketing. And it is indeed very rare for a paper to be able to recognize for both areas. So that gave me encouragement, and that was a third opportunity of basically a moment of opportunity recognition. I thought that now we are maybe able to basically up the ante a little bit. And I approached the Boston Consulting Group. And it would have never occurred to me in the beginning of the journey that I would be going to the New York office of Boston Consulting Group and pitching the theory to them. But fortunately, they decided to invest also. Again, crazy killed, right? Boston Consulting Group becomes a partner. So they provided financial assistance, but more importantly, they shared Capital IQ database with us, as well as some other proprietary data, which enabled us access to private data, as well as small firm data, which CompuStat did not have. And it was a gigantic effort for us to combine these two mega databases. It took quite a bit of effort, but we managed. And at the end of the process, then we can actually bring in heavy cavalry and they do really sophisticated analysis, longitudinal analysis, if you will. And another colleague of mine, again, adding more to the team, she brought the technique of MARS, multivariate adaptive regression splines, which really enables you to do sophisticated research and plots the relationship between variables of interest. And when we looked at the results, we were amazed. Decade after decade, industry group after industry group, it was basically the same results, very strong results. And after that, we also applied the same approach to market share elasticities. And again, arrived with basic strong results. And in a nutshell, that is the rule of three journey and my involvement in it. But I also have to, of course, thank my co-authors, my crazy killed partners in this journey, my colleague next door, Ayça Altıntı, who is now at Claremont Graduate University, my Mars methodological wizard, Kate Carnicina. She's the dean at Business and Public Policy at Mills College in the Bay Area in Northern California. Bob Windsor, who's also Professor Sheth student from University of Southern California. And Martin Reeves, who's senior partner and the head of the Henderson Strategy Institute at the Boston Consulting Group. So I have to thank all of them. And of course, last and most, I have to thank Professor Sheth for letting me involved and sharing this wonderful theory with us and letting us test it.
Well, no, actually, this is phenomenal. And, the thing is like, this is, you have, no wonder that you have been like, the chairman of American Marketing Association, especially for the entrepreneurship, because this is the first time in the analogy where I would have heard that how entrepreneurship is very similar to the research, from going step by step to IPO. This is a very phenomenal way of looking at things.
So let me add one more thing. There's actually a classic article called "Science is Marketing," which basically says the entire science research endeavor can be perceived as a marketing effort. But also, I cannot take credit for the entrepreneurship side of that theory. It's actually effectuation theory pioneered by Saras Saraswati at the University of Virginia. The lemonade example, bird in hand, crazy kilt. These are all basically parts of our effectuation theory.
Yes, sir. So that's really good, sir, and actually insightful. So my next question to you, Professor Sheth, is actually, if we can get into some kind of briefs that why is it that we call good players journalists, and why do you feel only number 3 have to innovative? Why not journalists?
Yeah, for number 3, it is a survival game. And the way the number 1, number 2 increases market share is by expanding the scope, scope of offerings, for example, geographical scope, not just scale. That's how they become generalist primarily, by adding product categories or offerings in a way through acquisitions or internally. Specialists remain focused. They're niche players, essentially, like a Porsche in automobiles. They would not become a mass car. We are right now debating whether Tesla will become a generalist or will remain a specialist. And the idea generally is that they should remain specialist, more go into the luxury market and take share away from BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and maybe Tesla, in fact, and maybe Porsche. Porsche is already trying to counterbalance it. There's enough opportunity to remain as a niche player. So generalists are one where it's a one-stop shop. Their main proposition is a value proposition, like a Walmart or Amazon. Amazon is probably the best generalist today you can find. Anything you ever wanted to is available at Amazon. On the other hand, you have a niche players who will be primarily offering, let's say in fashion industry, only fashion product category. Or there may be something like a Pinterest type, companies. There are quite a few in e-commerce the same way. It's evolving to, again, the same thing. You need both a generalist and a specialist, like a shopping mall. So number 3 company, it's the survival game. It changes the paradigm of the industry. So for example, Chrysler always led in design and engineering, not GM or Ford, although GM Tech Center is like Bell Labs. I've been advisor to Bell Labs and I've been advisor to Tech Center. It's phenomenal, but they are unable to commercialize their own technology, their patents. And similarly, RC Cola changed the paradigm against Coke and Pepsi by putting Coca-Cola in a can. So I'm always watching number 3 as somebody who will shift the paradigm, or a niche player who comes and becomes the disruptor essentially in the industry. So that's the background.
Yes, sir. That's a no, actually that's very insightful about number 3 being the most innovative. So
Yeah.
my next question is now to you, Professor John, about this thing is like, that there is an interesting figure or a table there in your first chapter that calls something about ditch. So I wanted to understand what are the options of, so first, what do you mean by ditch, and what exactly are the options with the businesses stuck in the ditch?
Sure. So the rule of 3 operates at both macro and micro levels. At the macro level, I forgot to mention that our research showed that if an industry is in the rule of 3 structure, it outperforms all competing structures by about 150 to 200%. So that's the macro force in play. And then at the micro level, there are generalists and specialists, as Professor Sheth mentioned, and then there's a third group stuck in the middle in the ditch between the two groups. So generalists tend to have more than 10% market share, and specialists tend to have less than 5% share. And in between the two, roughly 5 to 10% is the ditch range. And the companies in the ditch are outperformed by the specialists and generalists by another 70 to 120%. And the macro and micro levels are actually interact with each other. So imagine you're in the ditch in an industry that is not in rule of 3 formation, you will be in a severe disadvantage. So generally speaking, let's first clarify that the further away you are from the ditch, the better. So try to stay away. It is not an enviable position to be in. You're at a constant disadvantage essentially. So now let's consider the example and your options. So let's consider the PC manufacturing industry that Professor Sheth also referred to. In 2000, there were 2 companies in the US that were both in the ditch, HP and IBM. In fact, they were right in the middle of the ditch too. HP had 7.6% market share and IBM had 7% market share. So HP considered its option and decided it could not get out of the ditch organically. It's easier said than done by marketing and new product development and so forth. So it decided to merge with Compaq, which was a generalist with 13% market share. And that merger took place in 2001. And by the way, 10 years later, a decade later, that combined entity was the global leader in the PC manufacturing business. Now, the other player, IBM, took a different road. They, of course, saw the merger between HP and Compaq. They also decided they couldn't get out organically, and they decided to divest. So in 2005, they sold their PC manufacturing business to Lenovo. And by the way, after 2005, in about a decade after that, Lenovo itself became the global leader in the PC manufacturing business. And what did IBM do? It basically downsized, specialized, and it is a leading service provider today, but it is no longer in the PC manufacturing business. So your options are, you can try to get out organically, but that's easier said than done. The easier path is through mergers and acquisitions, or you can divest and specialize and become a viable specialist.
Wonderful. No, actually, that gives a great insight to this, and that how exactly stuff are, and this phenomenon is actually across all the technologies, all the sectors. Yeah. So,
Shreeram,
yes,
can
sure,
I
sir.
just add something?
Sure, sir.
There are strategies that we have articulated in the book. If you are number one company after an industry has matured, the best strategy is fast follow. It's a
Wonderful.
defensive strategy. So IBM always was a fast follower. Today, that's the case of Google, for example, Microsoft, everything. Somebody else invents something else. They have the market presence and then take it over. Like Zoom creates the video conferencing. Now you see Microsoft jumping at it and has the scale, so they may surpass Zoom. Same thing, you see cloud computing started by Amazon, but Azure platform of Microsoft is gunning for that. That's a typical strategy. So number one, company has to defend by fast following. Or to grow the market, offensive or aggressive strategy would be to grow the market, usually expanding into emerging economies or other countries. Number two company, when they're quite distant, number two compared to one, primarily should remain more coexistence. Go to places where the number of companies still doesn't have the capacity to go or has no willingness to go, so you go after. So Pepsi went into North American, the northern part of America. Coca-Cola was basically southeast tropical climate country area primarily. And then both began to race, and now Pepsi begins to challenge because of its market share. For number three company, clearly the defensive strategy is to protect a segment in which they may be very good or change the paradigm. As I mentioned about RC Cola, Chrysler, there are many examples. Lockheed was the same when you had the Boeing and McDonnell Douglas were the two large players. It's very predictable, essentially. For the niche players, very interesting strategy. Mostly strategy would be to bring a private equity guy, use one of the ditch players as a startup primarily, roll up everybody else, and you come out of the ditch and you decide whether you want to remain a specialty ditch company, multiple brands, for example, or you want to become a generalist, right?
Yeah.
If you're a niche player, only strategy is to go up to about 5% and then sell the company at a commanding premium, as it happened last week. I see the price that are paying right now in one of the industries where the price was so low. I think it just jumped up to about 160% or something, very interestingly. And then you start something else. You go further up or go super niche. So there are key strategies that are meant for each one of the three types of players in an industry. Sorry about giving that summary quickly.
No, absolutely. It really is, enlightening to hear this and, to really know how things are working. So it's my next question is to you only. And actually, I went through the book, and after reading the book, I felt that, I'm pursuing PhD, and I felt, there is quite a lot of similarity where in one of the topics that I'm pursuing, thinking to take as a subject, and probably it'll help the entrepreneurs on the call. So global expansion strategies for multinationals from emerging market. What is your thought about it?
Emerging market multinationals, once your market opens up, let's say India after 1991 reforms, or China with the Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms becoming more capitalistic, when global competition comes to your doorstep in India, you have no choice but to go global to counterbalance it. So for example, when the Europeans came to America in the tire business, Michelin came here with radial tires, America had no choice but to go to Europe. I was an advisor to Whirlpool Corporation. When Electrolux came to America buying out a private equity company, number of brands that collapsed after the first energy crisis, I told the chairman, we have to go to Europe, so we bought out Philips. And I said, this is the first round, second round will be all emerging markets. So we invested in India through TVS. Eventually now it's independent company. They have to be in China successfully. So to equalize each other, you have to go global. So emerging market multinationals are now becoming global out of sheer necessity, not just aspiration. So I give you one key example. In many of the basic industries, India is very good. So you take ArcelorMittal Arcelor company. Lakshmi Mittal starts rolling up, buying out all of the communist countries' steel mills because they are collapsing anyhow, buys some in America, becomes the largest steel company, basic industry. Against Nippon, And before that one, US Steel and those guys around here. Now Aditya Birla Group does the same thing in carbon black. They're number one through acquisitions. They also bought out in the flat aluminum sheet. Hindalco is the company there. They bought out Novelis. By the way, in steel, aluminum industry, again, we had a rule of three. It collapsed. The Canadian guys collapsed, and therefore they given private equity. Novelis was a spin-off of that one. So flat aluminum sheet, you can see the same thing. There's a race going on across many of the Indian industries. For example, the IT services industries. Are they going to consolidate, or will TCS become one of the big players? TCS looks like, from a market valuation, almost knocking the doors of Accenture now. So you still have the IBM, Accenture, there's a position for number three, and TCS actually has used the rule of three theory to say, we would like to be globally number three. On a market cap basis, they're doing very, very well. But can they have this share at the same time? So I can give you industries after industry examples, which are possible.
No, sir, absolutely. That TCS and yeah.
So what happens is that when the industry becomes global through deregulation of industries like airlines, or a new standard comes in, new technology becomes universal like radial tires, you consolidate. There is no room for 9 companies, 3 in America, 3 in Europe, 3 in Asia. Always it comes back to 3, which means there are mega mergers now. And that's what we see right now in pharma industry, in chemicals industry, for example, in many industries where, and same thing is happening surprisingly in consumer packaged goods industry, where Unilever, after aggregating all of the ice cream businesses, decides they will exit the ice cream business. It's up for sale.
Yeah.
Interestingly, multi-billion-dollar. They've just announced that they're going to divest by focusing back on their core business, the tea business. They bought Brook Bond, Lipton, survived them very well, created value. Now they want to divest the whole section pretty much. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. No, that especially the case that you were talking about, the TCS and Accenture knocking doors. I guess there is a chase keeps on happening on LinkedIn that we see that, our market valuation is better and ours is better. So that way, that chase is happening and quite visible. So my next question now I would like to ask to Professor John. So what are the implications of global rule of 3 on entrepreneurship?
Excellent question. So as we've been discussing the rule of 3, of course, the implications mentioned so far, they all apply to entrepreneurial firms of different sizes, right? Specialists, niche players, and generalists, and so forth. But usually the far left-hand side of the chart, the startups are ignored. So I want to make some comments about that. But first, let me give you some historical perspective of the perceived relationship between market share and financial performance. So the initial studies on this goes back to the 60s and then 70s, 80s. Throughout, the primary database that was used was the PIMS database. And it actually meant profit impact of market strategies, but most people thought it meant profit impact of market share, because they found a very strong relationship between market share and financial performance, and that was taught by the leading business schools and understood by the boardrooms. Market share leads to financial performance. Then came a time in the 90s, the resource-based view from the management side especially came in, and they said, this is a lot of contextual things going on here. Maybe the relationship is spurious. Do not pay that much attention to market share anymore. So that was the understanding for 10, 15 years. A few years ago, they did a meta-analysis of all the studies on this subject, and they again found a significant and positive relationship between market share and financial performance. But the conclusion was that the main elasticity was about 0.13, which they basically said, this is a weak relationship, so maybe there are other things we should pay more attention to. So that was the primary understanding. But I have to say that this is misleading at best and actually wrong, because that has to do with the understanding of elasticities. For example, another weak elasticity known to be weak, is the advertising elasticity. That's about 0.12. Which means if you double your advertising budget, your financial performance is about to go up by 12%. And it is considered to be a weak relationship in marketing, generally speaking. So the 0.13 for market share is not all that impressive. However, elasticity assumes a linear relationship throughout the entire functional form. So it doesn't care if you doubled your budget, tripled your budget, quadrupled your budget. It also doesn't matter the magnitude, the actual magnitude of the increase in budget. And it also doesn't care where you are on that curve at the time. Are you a generalist? Are you a specialist? Do you have 10%? Do you have 50%? It basically assumes a constant return between the input and output. So of course, counterintuitive, you think that's counterintuitive, right? The evidence, anecdotal evidence says this is wrong. Intuitively, you think this is not correct. And I can tell you, we have empirical evidence that this is not correct. So let me tell you. As I said, we applied multivariate adaptive regression splines to this entire relationship by looking at the elasticities in different ranges. And we asked the algorithm with a machine learning tool to tell us the inflection points. And the cutoff points for specialists, niche, and generalists come out beautifully. And in there are very drastically different elasticities for each group.
Right.
So on the right-hand side for generalists, the weak relationship between market share and performance is more or less okay. It is not 113, it's actually even weaker than that, but there's a weak relationship. But if I'm a ditch player trying to get out of the ditch, becoming a generalist, the elasticity is actually 0.55, not 0.13, 0.55, so 4 times as big. And then if you are a specialist sliding into the ditch, the elasticity is actually 1.56. Negative 1.56. So you lose market share. As you increase your market share, you lose financial performance so fast, your head will spin. So it is basically magnitudes higher and negative than what the meta-analysis suggested. Now, here is the more interesting part for the startups. If you're just starting up, you have less than 1%. The elasticity applicable to that range is actually 15. Wow. So, which means you scale or you fail. So if you have aspirations to be a significant player, if you are not a lifestyle business, you scale or fail. Even if after controlling all sorts of variables, that elasticity is still over 3. So it is highly elastic, and it really pays off to scale and come to the minimum efficient scale as we believe it is. So for a specialist, it's really critical to get the 1 to 1.3% market share to establish the minimum efficient scale of operation to be a viable specialist. So that's a key takeaway for basically entrepreneurship and for aspiring entrepreneurs as they consider the rule of 3 implications.
Wonderful. That's actually yeah.
Can I just add, Shreeram?
Sure, sir.
One of the biggest mistakes, I'm a TiE charter member in Atlanta chapter from 2000 or 1998, 99, and have advised quite a lot of entrepreneurs here as a part of our obligation. One of the key problems is that we invite VC capital too soon as entrepreneurs or inventors. Because one role when VC capital comes in is to push you for growth. That becomes negative. You must have a more controlled growth rather than worrying about competition. If it's something disruptive new, the total industry is expanding. So you can exist with other players. In fact, if you take Uber ride sharing, for example, which is consolidating to rule of 3 on a global basis through merger acquisitions, it's the same pattern. So my advice generally is that if you don't have to borrow money, don't. If you don't have to go to IPO, don't. Just try to slow down. Most long-lasting products or brand companies are family-owned, where they have a controlled growth primarily, because external capital, the debt capital that comes in, or an equity even, actually is more destructive. So you have to be very careful when do you invite venture capital, or even a mezzanine capital, or whatever kind it is. For the ditch players, you need the capital to get out of the ditch. It's just the opposite.
Absolutely.
So there are all kinds of possibilities. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Absolutely, that absolutely makes sense. That it does not make sense to take in money when it is not required, because it'll burn fast, and then there is a sustained pressure to make that growth to happen.
Yeah.
So my next question is to you only, and so it is like that you might be reading. There are some books like we have to save capitalism from capitalists and all that stuff. Emphasis being placed on capitalism these days. Well, do you think that entrepreneurship is more important than capitalism in terms of global future?
Yeah, I have a whole paper and actually a video on this one that I can share with people. Entrepreneurship is much more universal, first of all. Capitalism is not. It's very elitist. Entrepreneurship can be by a totally illiterate person or a scientist. Entrepreneurship refuses to recognize gender. Capitalism has a bias. Entrepreneurship does not recognize faith. Any faith has good entrepreneurs. Very key point. Very universal force. The real competitive advantage of a nation, as I'm propagating in India, for example, is entrepreneurship. Chinese are racing for now through policy mechanism as opposed to grassroots approach to nurture entrepreneurship. You can be a social entrepreneur. And there's a debate in TiE we always had, should TiE members be also going into social entrepreneurship, where return on capital is not the message primarily, but how do I serve the society, but using business principles. We had all kinds of debates in the meetings, pretty much. So you have the entrepreneurship can be social entrepreneurs, where profit and the delivery on return on capital is not the main objective, but serving the society profitably is an objective. That's a very key one. Entrepreneurship also is something that you give back the money. Capitalists don't give back the money. If you think about people who give back their money to the society, either through foundations or through charity in general, usually entrepreneurs, because they came from surprisingly from something that they never thought they would succeed. They are humble people, come from backgrounds of adversity. So they have always this belief that I should be serving, giving back to the society after successful. If you think about Warren Buffett, for example, if you think about Bill Gates, Azim Premji in India, they all come, they feel very strongly that after making money, you have an obligation to give back. I recommend building into the structure of the company. We have a book called The Forms of Endearment with Raj Sisodia, created a conscious capitalism as a movement. So it's very important that entrepreneurship is much more important. In fact, in capitalism, it only came by Adam Smith, which is only a recent concept, 1776. He found that 3 factors of production, land, labor, and capital is not enough. You need a 4th one called entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is thousands of years old. It's nothing new. Entrepreneurship for survival. And I have recently prepared a presentation on entrepreneurship by necessity.
Wow.
As very interestingly, we think entrepreneurship comes from passion. It comes from necessity because you lose a job, as it happened in 2008, as it happened with energy crisis. And all of a sudden you are working in the aerospace industry, they are not making any more, you're an engineer, you're in the middle of your career, young children, single wage earner family, and now what you do? So you buy franchises. There are many families I know who bought Dunkin' Donut franchise, Baskin Robbins franchise, because at least as Indians or Asians, we have some savings that you can go back. They have never worked harder in their life. I must tell you, you think we work very hard. Be a franchisee of Dunkin' Donuts, there is no life. 7 days a week, wake up at 4:30 in the morning, and you're working till about 9, 10 at night. So to me, entrepreneurship is a much broader concept, more noble concept than capitalism.
Absolutely. I completely agree to the point. It's a more noble concept than, and absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. So my next question is to you, Professor John, and I would like to know, are there any textbook industry examples of global rule of 3 that you would like to cite?
Sure. So the classic global rule of 3 industry example is the global tire business. But before I tell more about it, let me pose a challenge to the audience. So which tire maker historically is the most innovative of them all, arguably? And by arguably, of course, I know it is true, but others can argue about it. So if you maybe type it in the chat box, and then whoever guesses it correctly, maybe first we can give a copy of the book. I don't know if that's possible. But let me give some clues. So this company was founded in Akron, Ohio, the rubber capital, the tire capital of the United States in 1870. And then later on, it started one of the first research labs of any industry. When Charles Lindbergh flew over the Atlantic for the first time, the tires of his plane were made by this company. And then when Charles Lindbergh complained that he was worried about icing on the plane, they actually created the first de-icing mechanism in the industry and put it on his plane. This company invented the first rubber reclamation process, which became the industry standard. This company invented the PVC, polyvinyl chloride, which had many other applications such as floor coverings, luggages, insulations, parachutes, and so forth. This company invented the tubeless tire. This company invented the natural synthetic rubber, and that was critical because during World War II, US was cut off from natural rubber supplies, and the war may not have been won without this company. And so the list goes on and on. In fact, when NASA started sending astronauts to space, they contracted this company to build the first space suits for them that the astronauts wore. So which company might this be? So if you guess Goodyear, you would be wrong. If you guess BF Goodrich, you would be right. Yep. Now, interestingly, BF Goodrich was actually number 3 company in the US tire business. Number 1 Goodyear, then Firestone, and then BF Goodrich. But then when the Michelin and then Japanese Bridgestone competition came in, number 3, the most innovative company, as Professor Sheth observed, fell into the ditch. And they couldn't get out of there organically, and they realized their core competency was not even tire manufacturing. It was specialty chemicals. Whereas the margins in the tire manufacturing is razor thin, only 3 to 4% in the OEM side, they realized they could use their core competency much more, basically, it would pay off much better elsewhere. In fact, one of the tire company founders said Detroit wants their tires round, black, and cheap, and they don't really care if they're round or black. So they insisted on the razor thin margins. So BF Goodrich decided they should get out, and they sold their tire business to Michelin from France, and they got out of the industry altogether. Later on, they became a pure aerospace company with consecutive innovations, and when United Technologies acquired them in 2012, their market cap was more than 6 times that of Goodyear. I think Goodyear was about 3 billion, and Goodrich Corporation at the time had about 18 billion evaluation. So think about the value that they created in the process. It's another basically interesting story. But now let's go back to the tire business in the US, right? So Michelin comes in, Bridgestone buys Firestone. So Goodyear number 1, Bridgestone, Michelin, they are the 3 players in the US. BF Goodrich is out. And then Cooper Tire was a specialist. It is now owned by Apollo from India. And now global rule of 3 has also formed. We have now basically Bridgestone number 1, Michelin number 2, Goodyear number 3. But of course, who knows what will happen in the next decade. Apollo may challenge Goodyear for the number 3 spot. In fact, at the end of the book, we have an appendix where we make all sorts of projections for the next 10 years as to how these global industries might evolve. So that would be the textbook classic example of a global rule of 3 industry.
Absolutely. That's phenomenal. You know, so
do we have anybody win? I guess not.
Yeah.
That saves me the book.
Yeah, even I was thinking it's Goodyear, but it's not, it seems. So
I just copied in the answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Tariq, can we go with the questions that we may have from the audience? Or till then, I can just ask one last question, and then which is open to both of you, and then probably Tariq can ask questions from the audience. So before we do that, the last question that I would like to both of you to answer is, impact of COVID or high turbulence on the applicability of global rule of 3.
Yeah.
So Dr. Sheth, if you want to...
The global rule of 3 gets disruptions, either by technology, as we have seen quite a lot in the digital transformation that's happening pretty much. Cell phone disruptor to the PC business, for example, or the legacy systems in a way. It can happen by an event like a pandemic, if they last so long, because pandemic makes your habits change. You Absolutely. Are now in a lockdown situation, and therefore as a consumer, you are consuming differently. Suddenly you discover that the new way of consuming is better, surprisingly, out of a crisis. So for example, if you look at the retail sales in November, December, Christmas time period, more people ordered online first rather than go to the store. Even though stores were open, there's still concerns about catching the virus, for example. But then more importantly is the hassle, because you are now working in pajamas. Now you gotta dress up to go. You can't shop in pajamas. So you have to go and get up. It's a hassle. You don't have time. You have now become inertia. So why not order it online? And that's mind-boggling change. I think first preference is now more and more from physical to digital. So people are going to go for digital option first, searching for information, searching for product lines, ordering online, and then getting spoiled by having it delivered at home. So you're now changing permanently. So what was core, which is shopping to the grocery store or a department store on a daily basis or whatever you do, now you do it peripheral. So core becomes peripheral. And I will add one more thing. I know we are running for time. I find fascinating because I've again found very interesting. I'm into entrepreneurship myself. Anything we did as a daily necessity, when we give it up, always comes back as a hobby business.
Absolutely.
Hunting, fishing, gardening, baking breads, and now cooking. Have you seen the popularity of cooking channel? Everybody wants to be a chef now, which is interesting. So we are outsourcing eating. We are not making things at home, cooking, cleaning, childcare. And so they're all becoming more hobby businesses as we give up. So what is core becomes periphery. What is peripheral becomes core. Publishing industry is going through that. That's really what I expect. COVID phenomenon will create, like education, more online education now than actually going in person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor John, what are your thoughts on this?
I think we all miss the days Corona was a beer these days. Some people say that, of course, in a period of 8 weeks, the adoption of online retail and digital technology is advanced by 5 years. Others say over the last year it advanced by 10 years. So shake up and consolidation, that's part of the rule of three process, the global rule of three. So that's actually only going to help accelerate, basically the consolidation process will accelerate as a result. But there is another governing dynamic that I'd like to mention along with the global rule of three. So everybody knows the 5 forces of competition by Michael Porter. It's in the boardrooms, classrooms, everywhere. But not everybody is talking about the 5 forces of collaboration, and they should be talking about it more, especially when there's hyper competition. So you can, of course, collaborate with your suppliers, your customers. You can invest in the newcomers to the industry. Probably Toyota is regretting that they exited Tesla too soon, right? But you can also collaborate with your even competitors. In fact, I noticed this month's Harvard Business Review had this uncover how to collaborate with your fierce competitors. So I guess we meet them by a month because the book published last month, but they are just focusing on the competitors. Whereas what I'm saying is, think about the 5 forces of collaboration. So people usually think competition and collaboration are inversely related, which is not true. It's actually U-shaped relationship. So when there is not much competition, of course, people will collaborate. Think about the early days of the airline industry before the regulation. And then the regulation comes in, extensive competition. In fact, there was a period of time in 3 years, 1990 to 93, the airline industry in the US lost $12 billion, which was more than the money they accumulated in the entire history of the industry since inception. There were price wars everywhere, right? So collaboration comes down, but as the competition intensifies even further, then you must collaborate to survive. Otherwise, you'll simply go out of business. You must form coalitions. You must collaborate. So let me give one other example of this quickly. By the way, Warren Buffett said if there was a capitalist at Kitty Hawk, he should have shut down Wilbur because he lost so much money in his investments in the airline industry, especially US Airways. So he always regretted investing in the US Airways with airlines. But let me quickly give one example to the audience about how this collaboration can occur. And let me pose another challenge here to the audience. What's in my pocket and represents a $140 billion industry in the United States? It's a riddle. Now, let me give you clues. This product is only used about 20 times a year and sits idle most of the time. It is produced by Mint, but it is not candy. If you guess cell phone, that's not true. That market would be much larger than 140 billion. It's actually 750 billion or so. And it is not chewing gum either. But I guess maybe I was misleading the audience, right? So the product that's produced by the mint is actually a coin. Think about it. These days, you may not have in your pocket anymore due to the virus, but it's used about 20 times a year. And the entrepreneur from which I heard this story firsthand is Jens Molbech. And he was in his dorm looking at his jar of coins. And he did the research of the 15 billion coins in circulation. Only about 8 billion of them are actively used. 7 billion sits idle in jars, unused in some place in the houses. Yeah. And then he said, 7 billion times 20 uses a year is $140 billion market. So he invented the kiosks where you can bring your jar of coins, drop it in, and it gives you paper money, right? And then after he launched, he received a call from the Federal Reserve all of a sudden. They said, who are you and what are you doing? Tell us. Because the West Coast Federal Reserve canceled all of their orders for future coins indefinitely. Because he was basically circulating all these coins for the public benefits. And the Fed said, you are not a bank, we cannot regulate you. However, you are really helping us out because now we don't have to print all these coins, maintain them, distribute them. It's actually billions of dollars in savings for us. So what can we do for you, they said. And then later on, they actually introduced the company named Coinstar, by the way, to the UK Mint. And then UK Mint basically helped them out, roll it in the UK. So that's basically a collaboration between government and private sector, right? Which is not what most people think of. They think of public-private, but not necessarily government. But then Coinstar also collaborated with non-profit government, the non-profit organizations, the charity organizations. The Girl Scout cookies, usually they sell the cookies, but then returning the cash becomes a challenge, it turns out. Yeah. So they collaborated with Coinstar so that the Girl Scouts would turn the money back to the kiosks of Coinstar. And then even the people who want to donate money, they would go there, put their coins in and press the press of a button, choose their charity of choice, and it directly goes to the charity. So the charities actually would encourage their volunteers and the Girl Scouts to bring their cash, the coins, to the kiosks as well. Wow. So in the process, basically public, private, governmental collaboration, the company becomes a unicorn and has circulated, counted more than 1 billion coins, of course, to this day. So it's one other example of a collaboration when you think about 5 forces of collaboration more broadly.
Absolutely. That is phenomenal. You're talking beyond PPP and 5 models of collaboration. That's something that really needs to be looked upon. Tariq, would you like to have questions?
Sure. Thank you, Shreeram. Illuminating wonderful examples and good detail. And I like this thing, 5 forces of competition. Everybody focuses on that. Why not think about occasionally 5 forces of collaboration? Very interesting. Absolutely. So this model of 3, and this is for you, Professor Sheth. Yes. What are the 3 companies emerging to become the 3 big ones in the education sector?
Education sector is very different, and there are several exceptions to the rule of 3, and education comes into that one. Worldwide education sector is government funded, highly subsidized. It's a part of the government budgets. Even in America, while we think about private universities like Emory, my university, or Harvard, it's very small percentage. Most are large state universities. Because of them, they are not subject to the stock market investment pressures. Whatever they have is also funded by donors quite a lot. You have the charity, philanthropy. So that's the exception. The place where we see education becoming rule of 3 would be on online education. So you already see Coursera, which began the movement. And then, of course, you have seen edX platform, Harvard, MIT, basically what we call MOOCs. These are the open architecture primarily, and anybody can put their content, etc. And that's where we see the rise as a startup industry. It's global in nature already, in fact. And we are looking for which will be the 3rd one. Will that come from a publishing company like Pearson Group, which is going in that direction? But it may not be a typical university who will be number 3. It'll be mostly non-traditional competitors that will come in the industry. Mostly MOOCs online.
Yeah. What you're saying is not every industry is in the rule of 3, and I think you had said that. Yeah. Next question is for Professor John. You mentioned that whole thing about elasticity and the, it was very interesting because you were going into microeconomics and so forth. So to what extent do Wall Street analysts use the concepts you've put together on ditch, the numbers, the elasticity, or is this still a very new field and they are not using it?
No, the financial analysts, I think they are smart. They follow these publications even maybe more better, quicker than the academics do. After the paper was published, I immediately received some emails from some hedge fund groups, and they basically were asking, what does this mention? What does this predict for so-and-so industry? But the problem is they didn't want to share their data with us. And at the time, we didn't have the longitudinal data to be able to make deep predictions. But they certainly pay attention to these publications and they follow them. And I believe there were a few investors that have used the rule of three principles and made a lot of money too. Professor Sheth knows about that.
Yeah. Tariq, let me just add, Goldman Sachs on the sell side invited all of their companies and primarily advocated about rule of three consolidation in the cellular industry in America and eventually globally. So it is very much part of the investment banking people crowd. It is a part of, surprisingly now, more and more the venture capital, which is the other extreme, niche players primarily, or startup industries. So it is prevailing everywhere. I've been very surprised that the global rule of three is now used by antitrust, either testimony on behalf of AT&T, Time Warner, or T-Mobile and Sprint merger, for example, either side in litigation. It is used in China to say the optimal number of state enterprises should be nurtured is only 3. In fact, they go back to their history about empires. There are so many Chinese sub-empires, like in India, we have the kings and the emperors by geography, and they fought against each other. And there was a stability in the whole nation when 3 emperors coexisted. It's typical balance of power, because in a 3-way triad, the 2 can get together against the other one as a common paralysis, which is very key. So I can have a way of saying that don't do more aggressive one, because 2 of us together will actually benefit or counterbalance you, as it is happening between India, China, and America right now. I have an institute called India, China, America Institute, and I saw strategic rise of India in the process as China and America are becoming more and more global rivals, either in ideology or in capital or in infrastructure, whatever it is. So India is becoming very strategic. We apply this, I apply the rule of three also at a macro level from a policy and an ideology viewpoint. Yeah.
So by analogy, and I know this is a jump in thinking, but when I, as an investor, I am looking at startups, should I have a hidden bias which says I'm looking for 3 co-founders who are very well knit together?
The answer is yes and no, because you do need a third player. Usually we think there's a CTO, the inventor becomes, when after, venture capital becomes the CTO, typically you need a CEO, which is very important. But within the CEO, there are 2 parts. And the 2 parts, which is why the 3 becomes very important. The inventor is one, obviously. Then you have somebody who manages internal operations, ramping up the capacity and all the stuff. And then you have a sales and marketing person. So you need 3 to counterbalance each other properly. Yes.
Well, I have a model which says 4 persona types, but that's outside the conversation here. So while we are waiting for any other questions, this question is for Shreeram. Shreeram, you actually read the book, and in the conversation, we got some occasional reference to numbers and tables. And, for example, should the 3 companies have combined market share of 65%? Does that make it this industry? Like, could you extract over the next week or so some of the main numbers and tables and share those with the group? And, not everybody will be forced to read the book. Not that I don't want to promote the book. I think it's a great book to have. But being lazy like some of us can be, it would be lovely to have a little summary like that, Shreeram. Maybe our interns can do that.
Yeah, sure. I've actually tried to read the book in last 2-3 days as much as I could. But that I have now got 2 copies, one on Kindle and another is the hardbound. So yeah, absolutely. I'll go through the book. and I'll take both the luxuries of reading hardbound as well as on the Kindle and come up with some interesting statistics. The first one I already shared in the advertisement, that was like 4.3 trillion dollars, the market size, and then the concept of ditch. So yeah, I'll bring in all those things and definitely share with the audience. Yeah.
Look, I'm an experiential person, so I get much more from one sentence spoken by Professor John than reading 30 chapters or 30 pages. Next question.
Yeah.
Startups always arise out of a unique idea, but this idea, even if its potential can serve whole humanity, let me see. Maybe there's something missing in the typing here. Startups always arise out of a unique idea, but this idea, even its potential, can serve whole humanity. Let's move on. Can we work few popular ideas already started?
I don't understand.
Yeah.
What is the question?
Well, let's see. I think it's 8:41 and we're coming to time. I mean, I'm going to just summarize some of the things I took away, but this simple point, number 3 is often the most innovative. That's something that is definitely a takeaway. And then the conversation towards the end where capitalism versus entrepreneurship, Shreeram, that was a very insightful question. And very simply, entrepreneurship is much more universal. I mean, by nature, capitalists want to accumulate capital and keep it. Entrepreneurship has a completely different chemistry of human behavior and take and give and take and give and collaborate. So that's excellent. So unless either of you had any final questions, I think we can kind of start bringing this to a close. Professor Sheth?
Yeah, I did not mention in my original summary of the concept. Number one company usually should not have more than 40% market share. It becomes dysfunctional from a financial performance viewpoint and market cap viewpoint also, surprisingly. 40% is the ideal number. Number two company usually ends up about 20%. So it's 40, 20, and 10. So about 70% is the one consolidation ultimately arises where there's an optimality. The rest of it is either in the ditch or the niche players, essentially, in terms of shares by and large. So that's very important. Number one and number two begin to challenge each other, not realizing that there is a number third company who actually is the transformation in terms of ideas, in terms of disruption, coming out with a new pricing policy, new distribution angle, something like that. It's always a change agent is number three. So they have to do more business intelligence from the number three company, not against each other. So Pepsi and Coca-Cola may do a lot of business intelligence against each other, but it is something else that may bring about a change. And Anheuser-Busch and Miller did the same thing. GM and Ford, they watched each other, not realizing Chrysler is a real change agent in the industry, etc. Just go like BF Goodrich example that John mentioned. It's the same thing. Steel industry was the same. All in Pittsburgh. You had the U.S. Steel, then you had the Bethlehem, and you have a third steel company. I forget the name now. I studied in Pittsburgh, and that one was the change agent. Jones and Laughlin, I think was the name. And they were the change agents. They always did something differently, either in procurement or in process or in distribution, whatever they did. And you have to watch them primarily. That's the main point.
Right.
Okay.
Professor John?
So we've been giving these classic examples, but do not make the mistake that this is an old school theory which wouldn't apply today. For example, think about food delivery services, which is about 5 or 6 years old, but the rule of 3 has already arrived, right? We have Grubhub, we have DoorDash, and we have Uber Eats. And so DoorDash at 45%, Grubhub 22%, Uber Eats to about the same percent, but now they're acquiring Postmates, will achieve about 30% market share, which will be a traditional rule of 3 distribution that we would have predicted also, and all in the time frame of 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, it's happening in streaming.
Absolutely.
It's happening in streaming services right now. Everybody will jump to go from the typical cable platform or broadcast platform into streaming services. And again, like the automobile industry, search engine industry, race will start primarily. And ultimately, there'll be three guys who will dominate. Obviously, it looks like Netflix will survive clearly, but their share will come down. Disney seems to be the second most obvious choice. Ultimately, it'll be a race for the third position pretty much. And it is only global industry. Netflix today has more subscribers outside the US market, in fact, by a factor 70% outside, 30% inside in the US market. So they're already going global, which is very fascinating. The race will be toward who can faster globalize, capture the content which is in local cultures, like a German content, the French content, the Indian content, and aggregate together to be a generalist essentially.
I think these last two comments, they're very helpful because they make the strong connection between the big global pictures you guys are thinking about and writing about and ideas for entrepreneurs. And I think, the book may be, very heavy, but it needs to be gone into because there will be insights coming out. These very little examples that you're quoting, positioning. So if I'm a small startup, well, maybe I should focus on certain specialisms and not be tempted to go into, scale and everything and go into, the ditch zone. So otherwise also look at who are the bigger players who are in some trouble and they need to make acquisitions. So what are the likely acquisitions they're supposed to be considering? And therefore I can position my company to be acquired by them. So I'm sure there are many interesting angles. And Shreeram, thank you very much for thinking up of, bringing this extraordinary event today. We're out of our regular cycle. We do Thursdays every 2 weeks. And I'm very glad we got great attendance, great contents. So thank you very much. And Mohini, back to you.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Wanted to quickly show the next session. Actually, we ended up having 2 sessions today due to our special session today. We have another one coming up on Thursday. I'm going to quickly share my screen for any of you all who can join. We have a good session coming up with Shailendra Tipparaju, who's educationalist and venture capitalist, as well as is a startup founder. So it should be a very interesting session. So do join us if you can on Thursday. We've shifted the time slightly to accommodate both US and India. So if you can join at this time, that'd be great. And then I wanted to quickly thank everyone for joining today. We had several guests amongst us. Thank you for joining. Many charter members from all over, from Hyderabad, Atlanta, and many other parts of and many other cities were joining in. Special thanks to all of the Education SIG co-chairs for joining in today. We had Satish Cha and Paul Lopez. I think we have a little bit stepped over our time, so they, a couple of attendees have dropped off, but very, very nice to have everyone on board today. And special thanks to both Professor Uslay and Professor Sheth. This was a really wonderful session that we could incorporate. And wish you the best, and you're welcome anytime to join for our Education SIG. Let us know, and we'd be happy, really so happy to feature you anytime.
Thank you, and buy the book, please.
Sure.
Yeah, the name of the book again for.
I can show you.
Oh, there you go.
I don't know. Am I putting it right?
The screen.
Oh,
The global rule of 3.
That's right.
Amazon has it.
Top 5 in industrial marketing.
Yeah, Amazon has it, right? Okay. Thank you, guys.
Ultimate marketing to actually go ahead.
Yes.
Call to action is to actually buy the book and read it.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Wish you a good day. Bye.